Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews under fire for taking yet another trip to China. He's facing political attacks over why no media will be travelling with him to the authoritarian regime. There'll be no journalists to ask questions of the Chinese official he's with about trade. No journalists to raise human rights abuses of the Uyghurs, or whether TikTok is a spying app, or the origins of COVID-19.
Look after your backyard first, get it right, before you go on these secret trips to China.
This is Daniel Andrews' 7th trip to China, but his first since the pandemic. It's disproportionate compared to the number of times he's been to visit Japan or India during his time as Premier. It's also his first trip since his government was forced by Scott Morrison to tear up their controversial Belt and Road Initiative on national security grounds. The BRI, as you know, is debt trap diplomacy, and Australia shouldn't be beholden to China like this. Daniel Andrews today, though, defended his trip.
It doesn't say anything. It says that we're having a series of meetings back to back, and I don't think I've taken media on every single trip that I've ever done. There'll be other trips this year to lots of different parts of the world potentially. We still haven't firmed that up, but you'll be appropriately invited to those, and we've made our choice. You can have a view on that. That's entirely your job. Our partnership with China is incredibly important for our income, for our industry, for investment, for jobs, and for the strongest possible future.
And Bill Shorten also stepped in to defend his friend from attacks.
I think it's a positive thing that Premier Andrews is travelling to China. The federal government's position on China is very clear. We should cooperate where we can, we should disagree where we have to, but we should always engage in the national interest. If Premier Andrews is able to gain a deep and further trade ties with China, that's in everyone's interest.
We have to be clear-eyed here. China's aim in our region, in the Indo-Pacific, is hegemony. Just last week, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin held talks at the Kremlin in Moscow. Russia is becoming more and more isolated in the global community, as we've all watched its actions in Ukraine in horror. Leaders of the free world are meeting with Zelensky, but Xi has reaffirmed his and China's commitment to Russia. It's a show of solidarity. And at their meeting just 5 days ago, Xi and Putin pledged a new world order. There's a shift in the international community here, and China is emerging as a serious threat. You wonder whether Daniel Andrews will confront any of this. It's unlikely, especially away from the critical eyes of the media. China analyst Michael Shoebridge says there needs to be even more transparency than usual on this trip from Daniel Andrews.
Readout we'll get about what he did and what happened is solely down to the Beijing authorities' version of events and what the Premier himself tells us. It puts a bit of an obligation on Premier Andrews to be quite open and transparent.
Professor John Fitzgerald, who's a left-wing China expert, wrote a 30-page chapter on China's long cultivation of Victoria. And he made the point that Beijing has spent about 20 years developing ties in Victoria. Former Labor MP Michael Danby says the cultivation is long and deep, and he'll join me later this hour to discuss this. Now, we need to know, as Australians, did the Chinese Communist Party only agree to a meet with the Victorian Premier if he came without journalists? Were these the rules of engagement set out by China? There's no freedom of speech in China, no democratic media outlets. And don't forget, Australian journalist Sheng Lei is still being held hostage in China in dire conditions for absolutely no reason, falsely accused of spying. Her children left without a mother for going on 2.5 years now. This is yet another issue Daniel Andrews should be raising with his Chinese counterparts during their meetings. But will he? The political pressure on Andrews over this trip is only mounting. And this is before he even steps foot tonight on the plane.
Trip where he won't take any reporters. It'll only be reported by state-run media in China. And the question I would say is, Why are you going to China at this time? Why not visit regional and rural Victoria? Road networks smashed, hospitals smashed. Instead, you're going to China. He's visited China more times than he has Warrnambool in my electorate.
If Dan Andrews thinks that he can make more friendships over there in China, good luck to him. To me, I think there's certainly. There's no doubt we talk about war, we talk about China and war and all the rest. I still think that is a massive problem. If he still thinks that trade's going to fix all those issues, then good luck to him. I certainly am not buying into the rubbish.
We are in absolute crisis when it comes to debt. And if he's borrowing money in terms of a line of credit from China, he simply needs to say so. I think all Victorians would want to know who Daniel Andrews is meeting, what's the intention of the trip, and what's the benefit to Victorians.